Everyone thinks they know Bruce Lee. They know the lightning-fast kicks, the philosophical quotes, the perfectly choreographed fight scenes that made him look untouchable on screen. But what most people don't realize is that some of the most intense moments involving Bruce Lee never happened in front of camera. This story begins far from a movie set, in a cramped backstage area, thick with tension, ego, and unspoken rules. It was the kind of place where power wasn't measured by talent, but by who you knew and who stood behind you. Frank Sinatra was there, a global icon, a man surrounded by influence, authority, and an inner circle designed to keep him protected at all costs. And among them stood a bodyguard who didn't just rely on presence. He was presence, massive, towering, weighing nearly 350 pounds. In that world, size alone commanded silence. People stepped aside. People lowered their voices. People didn't challenge him until Bruce Lee walked into the room. Not loudly, not arrogantly, just calmly. No entourage, no need to announce himself. To some, he looked unimpressive, lean, compact, almost fragile compared to the mountain of a man guarding Sinatra. And that's where the misunderstanding began. Because while everyone else in that room was judging strength by weight and intimidation, Bruce Lee was operating on an entirely different level. What happened next wasn't planned. There was no script, no rehearsal, no safety net, just human ego colliding with discipline. Witnesses would later say the atmosphere shifted instantly, as if the air itself grew heavier. The bodyguard took a step forward, not aggressive, not cautious either, confident. And in that moment, something invisible but irreversible occurred. Because Bruce Lee didn't see a threat, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate a truth that would later define his legend. That real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rely on fear. It waits. And when the moment comes, it acts. The hallway was never meant to hold that many people. It was narrow, poorly lit, and heavy with the smell of old wood, sweat, and expensive cologne. Voices echoed off the walls, overlapping conversations blending into a dull hum. It was the kind of backstage space where nothing memorable was supposed to happen. Until it did. Bruce Lee stood slightly apart from the group, his posture relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. He wasn't studying anyone in particular, yet somehow it felt like he was aware of everything. Every footstep, every shift in energy, every unspoken challenge. Across from him stood Sinatra's bodyguard. Up close, the size difference was impossible to ignore. The man filled the space like a wall, broad shoulders, thick arms, a chest that looked more like armor than muscle. He had spent years relying on one simple fact. No one ever tested him. And usually, they didn't need to. But something about Bruce Lee disrupted that unspoken hierarchy. Not disrespectfully, not intentionally. It was subtler than that. The quiet confidence of someone who didn't seek permission to exist. The bodyguard noticed it immediately. He took a step closer, not out of rage, but out of habit. A territorial move. A reminder of who controlled the space. Conversations around them softened, then stopped altogether. People sensed the shift without understanding it. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't a performance. This was ego meeting restraint. Frank Sinatra watched from a short distance away, his expression unreadable. He had seen confrontations before. He had watched men posture, argue, and back down countless times. To him, this likely looked like another moment that would resolve itself in seconds. But this time it didn't. The bodyguard leaned in slightly, his shadow stretching across the wall behind Bruce Lee. To an outsider, it might have looked intimidating, overwhelming even. Bruce didn't move. No flinch, no defensive stance, no visible reaction at all. That alone unsettled people watching. Because humans are wired to respond to pressure, especially physical pressure. Stepping back, tensing up, bracing for impact. Bruce Lee did none of it. Instead, he exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but control. Those who understood martial arts would later say this was the most revealing detail. Not what happened next, but what didn't happen first. There was no rush, no explosion of motion, no attempt to prove anything. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes others uncomfortable because it forces them to confront their own intentions. The bodyguard hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the balance shifted. Because Bruce Lee wasn't waiting to react. He was waiting for the moment to end the misunderstanding. The tension reached a point where something had to give. The hallway felt smaller, the silence louder. Then, in a blink, the unthinkable occurred. Not chaos, not brutality, but a precise, controlled action so fast that several witnesses later disagreed on what they even saw. All they agreed on was this. The confidence in the room changed instantly, and the man everyone feared was no longer the one in control. What followed didn't look dramatic at first. There was no loud impact, no shouted warnings, no sudden chaos that people could easily describe later. In fact, for a brief moment, many in the hallway weren't even sure anything had happened. They only felt it. A shift, the kind of shift that makes your instincts wake up before your mind can catch up. The massive bodyguard, the same man who had dominated the space seconds earlier, now stood frozen, his confidence visibly shaken. Not embarrassed, not defeated, just recalibrating, as if the rules he'd relied on his entire life had suddenly stopped applying. Bruce Lee hadn't stepped back. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a spectacle of himself. And that was precisely what made the moment so unsettling. Because intimidation usually works through escalation. Bigger gestures, louder energy, clear threats. But Bruce Lee operated in reverse. He reduced everything. His movement, his breathing, his presence. It forced everyone else to feel exposed. Those watching began to notice details they'd ignored before. The way Bruce's posture stayed perfectly aligned. The way his eyes remained soft, almost uninterested, yet completely alert. This wasn't the focus of someone reacting emotionally. This was the focus of someone deciding. The bodyguard cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim authority. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. A sound meant to reassert dominance without committing to conflict. Bruce Lee met his gaze calmly. Not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as acknowledgement. In that moment, something deeply human occurred. The bodyguard realized this wasn't a man he could intimidate into submission or provoke into recklessness. There was nothing to push against, no fear to exploit, no ego to bruise. And that's when tension becomes dangerous. Frank Sinatra shifted his weight slightly, sensing the atmosphere had crossed a line. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was unfamiliar territory, the kind where outcomes couldn't be predicted by reputation alone. The hallway felt tighter. People leaned back against the walls, instinctively creating space without knowing why. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the one to interrupt whatever invisible negotiation was taking place. Bruce Lee remained silent. Silence can feel insulting to someone used to authority. It can feel like dismissal. And for a man whose job was to command respect through presence alone, that silence cut deeper than words ever could. But Bruce wasn't dismissing him. He was offering him an exit, a chance to step away without losing face. That's what made the moment extraordinary. Because true confidence doesn't corner others. It leaves them room to retreat. The bodyguard hesitated again, longer this time. His shoulders tightened, then relaxed. Internally, a decision was being made. Push further or recognize the situation for what it was. Witnesses would later say this was the longest second they'd ever experienced. And then, subtly, unmistakably, the tension broke. Not because someone won, but because someone chose restraint. The bodyguard took half a step back, barely noticeable, but in that environment it was seismic. Bruce Lee nodded once, not triumphantly, not smugly, just a simple acknowledgement, like closing a chapter that never needed to be written. The hallway exhaled. Conversations slowly resumed, though quieter now. People avoided eye contact, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. There was no clear narrative to cling to. No dramatic retelling that fit comfortably into myth or rumor. Just a shared understanding. They had seen something rare. Not a display of force, but a demonstration of mastery. And for Frank Sinatra, watching from the sidelines, the realization lingered long after the moment passed. Some men don't need to raise their fist to change the power in a room. They just need to stand still. To understand what truly happened in that hallway, you have to look beyond the moment itself. Because the real story wasn't about size. It wasn't about reputation. And it certainly wasn't about proving who was tougher. It was about how Bruce Lee saw the world. While most people are trained to react emotionally to pressure, Bruce had spent years doing the opposite. He believed that tension was not something to fight against, but something to dissolve. Fear, ego, and aggression were distractions. And distractions, to him, were weaknesses. Bruce Lee didn't train merely to strike faster or hit harder. He trained to see clearly. Long before that backstage encounter, Bruce had rejected the idea that strength lived in muscles alone. He studied philosophy as intensely as he studied movement. Taoism, Zen, the concept of flow, of water adapting to its container, yielding without losing power. Be water, he famously said, but few understood what that truly meant. In moments of confrontation, water doesn't resist blindly. It doesn't panic. It doesn't harden. It remains adaptable, aware, and patient, capable of becoming still or overwhelming depending on what the moment requires. That's the mindset Bruce carried into every situation. Standing in that hallway, Bruce wasn't measuring the bodyguard's weight or reach. He was reading intention, breathing patterns, balance, emotional state. He was listening to what wasn't being said. Because in real life, conflict begins long before anything physical happens. Most people escalate unconsciously. Their pride demands reaction. Their fear demands dominance. Bruce Lee had trained himself to step outside that cycle. He understood something most never learn. The first person to lose control has already lost. That's why his calm wasn't accidental. It was cultivated, rehearsed through years of discipline. Countless hours spent refining not just his body, but his responses. To Bruce, ego was the enemy. Ego made men loud. Ego made men predictable. Ego made men dangerous, mostly to themselves. In contrast, Bruce Lee valued clarity. He believed that the mind must lead the body, not chase it. That awareness must come before action, and that the goal was never domination, it was resolution. That's why, even in moments charged with tension, Bruce didn't rush to prove anything. He didn't need witnesses. He didn't need validation. He didn't need victory. He needed balance. Those close to Bruce would later say this was his greatest advantage. He didn't walk into rooms looking for conflict, but when it appeared, he didn't fear it either. He met it without attachment to outcome. That's a rare mindset, and a dangerous one to misunderstand. Because when someone has nothing to prove, intimidation loses its power. The bodyguard that day wasn't facing a man driven by pride. He was facing someone grounded in self-mastery, someone who understood that restraint is not weakness and silence is not submission. Bruce Lee didn't see confrontation as a test of masculinity. He saw it as a moment requiring intelligence. And intelligence often chooses the shortest path to peace. That's what left such a lasting impression on those who witnessed the encounter. Not the speed, not the technique, but the absence of chaos. Bruce Lee walked away exactly as he had arrived, composed, controlled, unchanged. But the room was changed. Because once you see someone remain calm under pressure that would break others, it forces you to question your own reactions, your own impulses, your own understanding of strength. And that's why Bruce Lee's true power was never physical. It was philosophical. It was mental. It was the ability to enter a storm and remain still. By the time the tension eased, something irreversible had already happened. Not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily pointed to or replayed, but internally, in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Because moments like these don't announce themselves with noise. They leave behind silence. And silence is weight. People began to realize that what they had just seen didn't fit into the categories they were used to. It wasn't a confrontation in the traditional sense. There was no clear winner, no dramatic climax that could be exaggerated in a legend. And yet, the effect was undeniable. The hierarchy in that hallway had shifted. The bodyguard, once the unquestioned force of the room, now stood quietly to the side. Not humiliated, not broken, simply recalibrated. His posture was different, less expansive, more contained, as if he had suddenly become aware of how much space he truly needed and how much he no longer did. Bruce Lee, on the other hand, hadn't changed at all. That's what unsettled people the most. He didn't linger. He didn't scan the room for reactions. He didn't seek acknowledgement. He adjusted his jacket slightly, offered a polite nod to someone nearby, and carried on as if nothing of significance had occurred. But for everyone else, nothing felt normal anymore. Whispers began almost immediately, not loud enough to disrupt the space, but persistent enough to spread. People exchanged looks, raised eyebrows, subtle expressions that said, "Did you feel that too?" Frank Sinatra watched from a distance, his face thoughtful. He had spent his life surrounded by strong personalities. Men who commanded rooms through reputation, wealth, or sheer presence. He understood dominance. He understood power. But what he had just observed didn't resemble any of it. It was quieter, sharper, more unsettling. Sinatra didn't intervene. Not because he was indifferent, but because there was nothing to intervene against. No line had been crossed. No spectacle had unfolded. Yet the outcome was clear. Control had changed hands without force. That realization lingered. Those backstage encounters were usually forgotten within minutes, swallowed by louder stories and brighter lights. But this one stuck, because it challenged assumptions people rarely questioned, especially in environments driven by status and intimidation. The idea that strength must be loud, that power must be visible, that fear must be enforced. Bruce Lee dismantled those ideas without ever addressing them directly. Later, when people tried to describe the moment, they struggled. Language failed them. Some said Bruce had done something. Others said he hadn't done much at all. Both were true, and neither captured the full picture. What shook everyone wasn't action. It was certainty. Bruce Lee moved through that hallway with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need the world to agree. That kind of certainty disrupts environments built on performance and posturing. The bodyguard understood this instinctively. So did Sinatra, and so did everyone else. Because after Bruce left, conversations resumed, but the energy never fully recovered. People spoke more carefully, laughed a little less loudly. The unspoken rules of dominance had been rewritten, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. That's how real influence works. It doesn't demand attention. It changes behavior. Days later, the story would be retold in fragments. Each version slightly different. Each shaped by memory and imagination. But all of them carried the same underlying truth. Bruce Lee wasn't someone you tested casually. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was grounded. And grounding, when paired with discipline, is profoundly destabilizing to unchecked ego. That moment backstage didn't make headlines. It wasn't captured on film. It didn't need to be, because the people who were there carried it with them. A quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to play the role others expect, and in doing so, change the entire room. Frank Sinatra had seen almost everything. He had walked into rooms where deals were decided with a glance. He had watched egos clash, alliances shift, and reputations collapse in seconds. Power, to him, was familiar territory. And yet, what unfolded in that backstage hallway didn't resemble any form of power he recognized. Because Sinatra didn't see intimidation. He didn't see aggression. He didn't even see confrontation in the traditional sense. He saw stillness. From where he stood, Sinatra observed the entire moment without interrupting it. Not out of hesitation, but intuition. Something told him this wasn't a situation where stepping in would help. This wasn't about protection or control. This was about understanding. As the tension peaked, Sinatra's instinct was not fear, it was curiosity. He noticed the same thing others did. Bruce Lee wasn't posturing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even asserting himself verbally. And yet, the space around him responded as if he were. Sinatra had spent decades mastering presence. On stage, in meetings, in private rooms. He knew how attention moved. He knew how silence could be louder than sound. And watching Bruce Lee, he recognized something rare. A man who didn't borrow authority from his surroundings. He carried it with him. Sinatra glanced briefly at his bodyguard, the same man who had always been a guarantee of security. A human barrier, a statement in itself. For years, that presence alone had prevented situations from escalating. But now, the equation had changed. The bodyguard wasn't overpowered. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't challenged directly. He was disarmed psychologically. And Sinatra understood what that meant. Because Sinatra knew men. He knew that when someone's sense of dominance dissolves quietly, it leaves a deeper impression than any public defeat ever could. There was no story to spin, no excuse to cling to, just an internal reckoning. Sinatra didn't step forward. He didn't say Bruce's name. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't restore order with authority. He simply watched. And in that watching, he made a decision, whether consciously or not, to respect what was unfolding. This wasn't weakness. This was awareness. Sinatra realized that if he interrupted, he'd reduce the moment to something smaller than it was. He'd turn it into a misunderstanding, a dispute, a clash of personalities. But what he was witnessing was clarity. Bruce Lee had entered the space without trying to control it, and yet control had reorganized itself around him. That kind of influence doesn't respond well to interference. So Sinatra let it be. Later, those close to him would say Sinatra became quieter after that moment. Not disturbed, reflective, as if something he believed about power had been gently but firmly adjusted. He didn't speak publicly about it. He didn't turn it into a story. That alone spoke volumes. Because Sinatra was no stranger to myth-making. If he had wanted to amplify the moment, he could have. Instead, he allowed it to remain contained, a private observation rather than a public narrative. Why? Because some moments are too honest to exaggerate. And Sinatra understood that what he had seen wasn't something you advertise. It was something you learn from. Bruce Lee left the building not long after, unnoticed by most. No dramatic exit. No lingering gaze. No acknowledgement of what had occurred. But Sinatra noticed. He noticed how the room slowly returned to motion, never quite regaining its previous rhythm. He noticed how people treated Bruce differently afterward, even without speaking about it. Most of all, he noticed something within himself. A recognition. That real authority doesn't always come from status, protection, or force. Sometimes it comes from a man who knows exactly who he is and refuses to be pulled out of that knowing. And in that moment, Frank Sinatra, a man the world bowed to, understood why sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is watch. Stories like this survive not because of what can be proven, but because of what they reveal. No footage exists of that backstage moment. No official report. No dramatic retelling sanctioned by those involved. And yet, the story endures. Because at its core, this was never really about Bruce Lee, Frank Sinatra, or a bodyguard. It was about an idea, one that quietly challenges how people understand strength. Over time, the details blurred. The setting changed. The faces shifted. Some versions grew more dramatic. Others softened the edges. That's the nature of legend. But the essence remained untouched. Bruce Lee was not remembered as the aggressor. He was not remembered as the victor of a confrontation. He was remembered as the man who didn't need one. That distinction matters. In a world obsessed with dominance, Bruce Lee represented something else entirely. He showed that mastery doesn't seek validation, that discipline doesn't announce itself, and that true confidence is often invisible until it's tested. What made the moment legendary wasn't force. It was restraint. Those who were there didn't walk away talking about techniques or speed. They talked about how the room felt afterward, how the atmosphere changed, how something unspoken had been exposed. That exposure is uncomfortable because it forces a question most people avoid. If strength isn't about size, volume, or intimidation, then what is it really about? Bruce Lee offered his answer not through speeches, but through presence, through alignment between mind and body, through a refusal to let ego dictate behavior. That's why the story resonates decades later. It reflects a truth many recognize instinctively but rarely live by. Real power is internal. It's the ability to remain composed when provoked, to remain clear when others escalate, to choose resolution over reaction. This is why Bruce Lee's legacy extends far beyond martial arts or film. He wasn't just teaching people how to fight. He was teaching them how not to. And in doing so, he challenged the deepest assumptions about masculinity, control, and authority. Frank Sinatra understood that. The Bodyguard understood it. And so did everyone else in that hallway, whether they wanted to or not. That's why the moment didn't need a headline. It lived on through quiet retellings, through thoughtful pauses, through changed behavior. Because when you witness genuine self-mastery, it lingers, not as fear, not as awe, but as reflection. Bruce Lee once said that knowing oneself is the greatest challenge a person can face. That night, he demonstrated what it looks like when someone has already met that challenge. He didn't conquer a man. He transcended a moment. And that's why the story matters. Not because it proves Bruce Lee was dangerous, but because it proves he was disciplined. Not because it glorifies confrontation, but because it shows how power can exist without it. Legends fade when they rely on exaggeration. This one endures because it points to something real, a quiet truth. The strongest people in a room are often the ones who don't need to prove it.